Turning now to Measure 114, Oregon's voter-approved gun reform measure that was paused by a state judge before part of it even started. Tonight, that measure is still on hold, but there are some behind-the-scenes developments that happened late Friday that could decide the next steps. The state attorney general's office has petitioned the Oregon Supreme Court to overturn the Harney County judge's ruling that stopped Measure 114 from taking effect. They're basically saying, come on, you guys, toss this thing out. In a 69-page request, the AG's office says if the court won't throw out Judge Robert Racio's rulings, it should make Racio explain why the court should maintain his rulings. In other words, make him argue to you, the Supremes, why his ruling makes sense and should stand. And here's the long and short of it. The state Supreme Court will either accept or deny this petition from the AG's office. If they deny it, the case will stay as it is right now, paused for an undetermined amount of time until the judge rules on the constitutionality of each part. And that could take months, and in theory, it could even take years. But if the state's high court accepts this petition, there are only two options. They'll either decide if they should throw out Racio's ruling on 114, or they'll make him explain why they should uphold his rulings. It's worth noting that this isn't the state Supreme Court's first run-in with Measure 114. Early on in this process last month, the High Court rejected an effort from the Attorney General's office. They'd asked the court to block what was then a temporary restraining order against 114 issued by the same judge. 114 is not a new issue for the state Supreme Court, but the court is new when it comes to reviewing 114. In the last month, there's a new Chief Justice following the departure of Martha Walters. In addition to that, there are two new associate judges sworn in earlier this month. So we'll have to see if that new makeup of the court changes anything in the way that they rule on this Measure 114 question. Now, let's dig a little bit deeper into the petition from the AG's office. The state is arguing that the will of the people is being thwarted by the pause and that the Supremes need to fix that. 114 passed in November with 50.7% of the vote. So, yeah, legally, it is safe to call that the will of the people, I guess, but it's more like the will of just barely over half the people who voted for the measure. Anyway, if allowed to go into law, Measure 114 requires you to get a permit before you can buy a gun. It requires a background check is completed before a gun can be released to you. And it restricts the sale, manufacture, and use of magazines that hold more than 10 rounds of ammo. Now remember, this case we're talking about, this one that has 114 on hold right now, it's not about the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. No, instead, it's hinged on Article 1, Section 27 of the Oregon Constitution, which establishes a right to bear arms. And when it comes to magazines that hold 10 or more rounds, Judge Racio has ruled those magazines are not distinct from arms and are therefore protected by the state constitution. But in this legal filing, by the Attorney General's office, the lawyers argue that Racio made fundamental legal errors and acted beyond his discretion. They insist that Article 1, Section 27 of the state constitution protects the right to bear arms commonly used by Oregonians for self-defense way back in 1859 and earlier, and they write that does not apply to magazines that hold 10 rounds or more. The AG's office went on to argue that, at a minimum, the state Supreme Court should allow the high-capacity magazine ban to be implemented, as well as allow the parts of 114 that require background checks to be completed before a gun is released to a buyer. Did you know, right now, if you buy a gun and your background check takes longer than 3 business days, the dealer can legally give you that gun? 114 would close that loophole, but it's not being closed while it's paused. By the way, we've been asking the state police how many guns have been released through this loophole since the election. They took a while to get back to us, and then they told us, yeah, no clue. They don't keep track. They don't know. So there's that. The Attorney General's petition goes on to talk about other mass shootings around the U.S., the California synagogue shooting, the Charleston church shooting, and the shooting at the Safeway in Bend back in August. The shooter there had 4 legally purchased 30-round magazines. He sprayed more than 100 rounds into the store, ultimately killing 2 people. The petition reads, the longer that the trial court's injunctive orders remain in effect for the months or years in which the case is pending in that court, the greater the possibility of another comparable tragedy happening here in Oregon. These dangers are real, they write, and Measure 114 reasonably seeks to safeguard against them. Okay, so where are we at here? We're waiting for the Oregon Supreme Court to say whether it will take up that petition or not. And in the meantime, the folks who want to block 114 to keep that in place, well, they're likely going to file their answer to the Attorney General's arguments on January 27th, maybe a little bit earlier. So where we're at is we're back to a Measure 114 waiting game. Nothing has changed about gun laws in Oregon since the election, and we have to wait to see how things play out in the judicial branch. We will keep you posted on whatever happens next.